fiscal year of 2021, 34 accidents in total, 2 of those fatal. That's a jump of 6 accidents from what occurred in the previous year. And you'll see here a representation by type of injury. The map on the right doesn't include the accident for Rhode Island because that map's generated using a different data set. And Massachusetts, with the largest population of the 6-state area, has the largest number of accidents. In terms of the types of aircraft that are involved in that set of accident statistics, the distribution is what you see here. So we've got the majority are tricycle gear aircraft, a very large participation by gliders, unfortunately, this year. Tailwheel, what we would describe as light or very light aircraft, 2 turbine, 2 helicopter, and 2 balloon accidents. And then here, just within the Boston FSDO, which is the area shaded in blue on the map at the right, again, a distribution of accidents by injury type running from 2011 to 2021. And so no fatals within the FSDO under 2021. Hard to call anything here a trend because the numbers are still relatively small, but they are distressing for anyone who's unfortunately affected by the accident, and each one has some lessons to teach us as well. So what are the major issues that are continuing to show up during this most recent period of time that we're looking at, roughly a year to a year and a half, depending on whether we're looking at the fiscal year or calendar year data? So first and foremost is a loss of control, and that keeps showing up over and over again. It's essentially hitting things that really shouldn't be hitting with an aircraft, and these are happening during departures and takeoffs as well as during landings, and we'll go into some detail on that. Then there's an area of mechanical failure / maintenance. So we'll look at some examples. In every case, the examples we show are representative, but there are more accidents behind the curve than what we'll show you tonight. We've got sort of classic pilot error or operator error, and we'll look at specific examples of those coming out of the accidents that we've seen in the FSDO, fuel exhaustion and checklist mistakes, but we'll get to those. Airspace incursions, which is certainly a good way to ding your ticket and have a nice sit down with the FAA. Not something you want to do, and can also create conflict with other operations in that same airspace. Seeing a lot of runway incursion, excursion, and lineup mistakes happening. So we'll dig into those, and then issues around pilot currency. And then the last category here is issues with drugs and alcohol, which are showing up in a very large and surprising percentage of the accident investigations that are being conducted by FAA and NTSB. So within the loss of control bucket, we're looking at approach and landing, typically involving striking an object or experiencing a hard landing or pilot-induced oscillation, porpoising. Those tend to be lower energy accidents than those associated with the takeoff and departure, because as you're landing, you're subtracting energy from the airframe, and that increases survivability. Takeoff and departure accidents tend to be more challenging because you're continuously adding energy to the aircraft as you move down the runway and initiate the climb out. And once you're above about 40 feet, things get very difficult if it's a rapid return to the ground. Challenges in the area of takeoff and departure can involve errors associated with weight and balance that could be miscalculations or related to inappropriate loading, incorrect throttle or power settings, incorrect mixture setting, prop issues with how it was set or how it's performing, issues with delivery of fuel to the engine or engines, aerodynamic configuration problems where there's a failure to get those control surfaces and flaps and other high lift devices set as necessary, trim inappropriately set, bad choice of runway that can affect your ability to get off the ground and clear obstacles, and a failure to correct effectively for a crosswind. And so we'll look at some specific examples here of approach and landing accidents. So this was simply a case that the Plymouth mass of an aircraft landing in very strong winds, and when the event was over, bent metal, but just minor injuries, and the pilot did acknowledge that they probably should not have been flying in that much wind. I know every pilot alive has found themselves in a situation where you've made it into the air and then you're all of a sudden realizing, maybe I really shouldn't be here right now. This was not the greatest choice. You may have the opportunity, though, to find another airfield with a crosswind runway that might be more favorable to the landing that you have to complete successfully. And it may not be where you intended to land, but it might be a better place to go. And this is an aircraft that lost directional control during landing and struck airport signs. And you can see the type of damage that occurred here to this airframe in Groton, Connecticut. And this is another aircraft that encountered a microburst a couple of 100 feet above the runway surface and ended up landing beside the runway, and resulted in a loss of control with the damage that you see happening here. And then this was interesting. So the way this was described in the NTSB report, this aircraft was being used with an instructor and the pilot who were practicing the impossible 180-degree turn, which is, of course, hard enough to do when it's a surprise, but it ended up with a hard bounce landing, which resulted in a loss of control with an excursion, with the striking of some objects en route to the final stopping point for the airframe. And the NTSB did cite that the flight instructor's delayed remedial action was a factor in this. One would think that if things weren't developing well during the final stages of that landing, having practiced this turn, bring the power up, go around, and do something different for a better outcome would be, ideal. But stalled onto the runway during the landing flare, and we'll see more of those as well. So this was an aircraft that ground looped when, during the landing, it turned out they were going to impact park gliders. And so there was a loss of directional control in gusty wind conditions. This is an image of that aircraft before the accident. And then this is a case of an aircraft, a glider, that essentially ended up executing a flare with the air brakes in the fully extended position. And it resulted in a stall where the aircraft impacted the surface of the ground. Very hard landing, and unfortunately generated serious injuries for the flight instructor. And the NTSB cited the flight instructor's lack of remedial action in this case as well. And you will see several examples tonight, unfortunately, of where the instruction hasn't met the high standard necessary to protect the safety of the flight, and bad outcomes are the result. Everyone who's getting back into flying on a more regular basis coming out of the pandemic has to work extra hard to achieve the good outcomes that we expect and everybody wants to achieve with every flight that takes place. This was an aircraft, and you can see here the skid marks that are on the runway. It was a failure to maintain directional control during a landing in a crosswind, and then once impacting the snow, the drag caused the aircraft to flip over onto its back, nose over, with the damage as you would expect for that type of accident. And then this was classified as an accident because of the severity of the damage. In this case, was bird strike, and if it hadn't been that severe, then it would have just been recorded as an incident during descent. Now we're going to look at some accidents that relate to the sort of takeoff and go around phases of accident. This is an aircraft, and there were many similar to this in New England during the past year. Aircraft that were new to the owner. So in this case, this was first flight of an aircraft new to that owner with their spouse, and had a pet on board. And during the course of the takeoff roll, the baggage door opened. As we know, baggage doors are designed to trail in a relatively closed position. But it would seem that the pilot had made the better of bad choices to try to resolve this so that they didn't risk losing their pet out the back of the aircraft. Unfortunately, the fence at this runway on Block Island is one that doesn't get old. It's being replaced on a regular basis because a late abort, as in this example here, results in an overrun down a slope that causes impact with the fence. And we've seen it before. It happens all the time. The FSDO gets a lot of notifications about runway overruns at this airport. And others that are notorious, now that Marlborough is closed, that's not a factor here, but Cranland shows up in these reports. And here at Block Island are a couple of other examples of aircraft. Everyone survived and nobody ended up being trapped in these two aircraft that you see here, one from 2016, one from 2017. But you see the amount of energy, again, as we talked about during a takeoff scenario, where or an overrun, the aircraft suffered a separation of the wing during impact with the highway fencing and the trees. And in the aircraft from 2016, after egress, the aircraft did burn quite badly. Now, this has a video clip recorded by security cameras. So you'll see the aircraft highlighted with the red arrow moving along in stages. To explain how this accident happened, this is a case where a Cessna 402 was practicing circle to land approaches with go-arounds. And being a multi-engine aircraft, it's a procedure that the crew had practiced quite a bit in the simulator. And this was the first time they were trying this in the aircraft instead of in the sim environment. So during one of these approaches, when they did a go around, during the climb out, the instructor retarded the throttle on the left engine to simulate the engine failure. The aircraft continued around the pattern and came back down to execute the failed engine landing. Now, during that process, when the engine failed in terms of simulated failure, they ran the checklist items that require bringing the boost pump on for the left engine. Unbeknownst to them, what had happened then is that engine flooded. And so when they then returned to the runway and went to have a go around, the left engine did not produce sufficient power. And that resulted in the loss of directional control, which you'll see here. So now the power is coming in. You can see the airplane swinging around, so it's starting to point directly at the camera. And the flight instructor takes over, and at some point it's inevitable, so they're going to end up with a hard landing, and you'll see the aircraft come back into frame from stage left. Now, we'll let this finish and then go to the slide that brings you the NTSB details. Probable cause was the flight instructor's failure to confirm the position of the aux boost pump during a simulated engine out procedure, which resulted in excess fuel, subsequent partial loss of power, etc. The Boston FSDO has stated that the pilot was performing a memorized engine failure checklist that they had drilled to perfection in the sim, but when it was applied to the aircraft in real life, that resulted in the partial loss of power on the left engine, and that led to the aerodynamic loss of control on the next go around, which led to the hard landing. This one is preliminary, so you should look at the final report when it becomes available, but this is a case that looks like the aircraft was attempting to land with a tailwind, and when performing a go around, when it looked like that landing wasn't going to be successful, wasn't able to achieve the climb gradient necessary to avoid the trees, and it did end up crashing. There was a fire. People did evacuate from the aircraft, and it's fortunate there wasn't loss of life or a more tragic outcome, but I'm sure that the people were affected by this quite badly, with serious injuries for all 7 people involved. So every one of these is something to think about. And this is a pilot that had almost 18,000 hours of experience and more than 10,000 hours of experience in type. So, and then this was, again, a preliminary. Watch for the final report. This is a case of an aircraft. Again, we're talking about that higher energy state associated with the takeoff, but the takeoff roll was going slower than anticipated, as described by witnesses. And we do know that about 2/3 the way down the runway, the flight crew applied the brakes, but it was too late. The engines were only producing 91% thrust. The aircraft did leave the ground, albeit over a short distance, and came back down to the tragic outcome that you see here. So this is a takeoff gone wrong, which is certainly, there's a sort of rule of thumb some people like to talk about, and that's that if